The crack of a revolver shattered the peaceful dawn over Riverside, Wyoming, as Matthew Jenkins stood motionless, watching his own father level the smoking gun at him. Blood seeped through Matthew's shirt where the bullet had grazed his shoulder, but the physical wound paled in comparison to the betrayal etched across his face. It was 1875, and the man who had taught him how to ride, shoot, and survive the unforgiving frontier had just tried to kill him over a land deed that rightfully belonged to the Jenkins family. "Next time I won't miss," Franklin Jenkins snarled, his weathered face twisted with greed, eyes cold as the Wyoming winter. "Get off my property. You're no son of mine." Matthew's fingers instinctively brushed the leather pouch hanging around his neck that contained his mother's wedding ring, the only piece of her he had left after she died, bringing him into this world. 26 years of lies unraveled before him as his father's true nature emerged. "You're choosing land over your own blood." Matthew's voice was steady despite the storm inside him. "Land is the only thing in this world worth having," Franklin replied, cocking the hammer again. "Your mother never understood that either." Matthew backed away slowly, mounting his chestnut stallion without turning his back on the man he'd spent his whole life trying to please. "You'll regret this," he said simply, before spurring his horse toward town. The 10-mile ride to Riverside gave Matthew time to process what had happened. His father had always been hard, but never cruel, at least not until gold had been discovered on their southern pasture. The change had been subtle at first. Extra bottles of whiskey, hushed conversations with mining company representatives, and then the ultimate betrayal, forging documents to transfer sole ownership of the family ranch to himself, cutting Matthew out entirely. Riverside was bustling with the usual morning activities when Matthew arrived. The small frontier town had grown considerably in the past few years as settlers pushed westward, bringing with them dreams of prosperity and new beginnings. For Matthew, the town had always represented freedom from his father's critical eye and demanding presence. He tied his horse outside the doctor's office, wincing as he dismounted. The bullet graze needed attention, but his mind was on something else: the papers his father had forged. If he could prove the forgery to the county judge, he might still save his inheritance and the only home he'd ever known. "My word, Matthew Jenkins, what happened to you?" Dr. Thompson exclaimed when Matthew pushed through the door, blood staining his shirt. "Hunting accident," Matthew lied, not ready to voice the truth aloud. As the doctor cleaned and bandaged his wound, Matthew stared out the window at the bustling Main Street. Wagon trains passed through, bringing supplies and new settlers. Among them, he noticed an elegant carriage stop in front of the town's only hotel. A woman in a blue traveling dress stepped down, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat adorned with a single feather. There was something graceful about her movements that caught his attention, momentarily distracting him from his troubles. "You're lucky," Dr. Thompson said, tying off the bandage. "Another inch to the left and we'd be having a very different conversation." Matthew paid the doctor and stepped back onto the boardwalk, his mind returning to his predicament. His first stop would be the law office of Judge Wilson, but as he turned in that direction, he collided with someone rounding the corner. "I'm terribly sorry," came a melodic voice as Matthew steadied himself. The woman in the blue dress stood before him, a leather portfolio clutched to her chest. Up close, he could see her features: clearly warm brown eyes that turned amber in the sunlight, chestnut hair pinned carefully beneath her hat, and a determined set to her jaw that suggested she was not someone easily swayed once her mind was made up. "The fault is entirely mine, miss," Matthew replied, tipping his hat. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Violetta Ardell," she offered with a slight smile, extending her gloved hand. "Matthew Jenkins," he replied, taking her hand briefly. "You're bleeding, Mr. Jenkins," she observed, nodding toward his shoulder where fresh blood was seeping through the doctor's bandage. "It's nothing serious," he assured her, though the wound throbbed painfully. I doubt the doctor would agree if you've just left his care, she replied. Perhaps you should sit down for a moment. Before he could protest, she had guided him to a bench outside the general store. There was a quiet authority in her manner that reminded him of his mother in the few memories he had of her, gleaned mostly from his father's reluctant stories. "Are you new to Riverside?" Matthew asked, curious about this forthright woman. "I arrived this morning," she confirmed. "I've come to teach at the new schoolhouse. The town council wrote that they were in desperate need of an educated woman to civilize the local children." Matthew couldn't help but smile. "Riverside could certainly use some civilizing, Miss Ardell. Please call me Violetta," she said. "And what about you, Mr. Jenkins? You don't strike me as someone who needs civilizing." "Matthew," he corrected. "And don't let the clean shirt fool you." "I'm just a rancher." Her eyes assessed him thoughtfully. "A rancher with a gunshot wound he's calling a hunting accident. I may be new to the West, Mr. Jenkins, but I'm not naive." Their conversation was interrupted by the town sheriff approaching, his expression grim. "Matthew, I've been looking for you. Your father's in town making some serious accusations." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Is that so? He's claiming you tried to steal documents from his safe and shot at him when he caught you." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "He's at Judge Wilson's office now, filing a complaint." Violetta observed the exchange silently, but Matthew could feel her curious gaze on him. "Sheriff, my father shot me this morning over a land dispute," Matthew said quietly, showing the bloodied bandage. "The ranch belongs to both of us. My mother's will was clear on that point," the sheriff frowned. "That's not what Franklin's saying. My father has never been overly concerned with the truth when it conflicts with what he wants," Matthew replied bitterly. "Well, you'd better come along and give your side," the sheriff said. "Judge Wilson will want to hear both accounts." Matthew stood, then turned to Violetta. "I apologize for cutting our introduction short, Miss Ardell. Welcome to Riverside." "Mr. Jenkins," she called as he started to walk away. "In my experience, the truth has a way of revealing itself, even in the most tangled situations." Her words stayed with him as he followed the sheriff down the dusty street toward the courthouse. The truth would indeed come out, but at what cost? The confrontation at Judge Wilson's office was exactly as bitter as Matthew had anticipated. Franklin Jenkins stood tall and imposing despite his 60 years, the silver in his hair and beard giving him a distinguished appearance that belied his true nature. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest coat, playing the role of the respected rancher betrayed by his ungrateful son. "He's always been wild, Judge," Franklin was saying as Matthew entered. "His mother's temperament. I've tried to guide him right, but some men just won't be led." Judge Wilson, a fair man who had known the Jenkins family for decades, looked between father and son with troubled eyes. "Matthew, your father claims you attempted to steal documents from his safe this morning and fired upon him when discovered." Matthew's laugh was hollow. "That's convenient, considering he shot me." He pulled back his jacket to reveal the bandaged wound. "I went to confront him about forged transfer documents he's been preparing. He's planning to cut me out of my inheritance land that my mother left to both of us." Franklin's face darkened. "More lies. The boy has always been jealous of what I built." "What you built?" Matthew's anger flared. "Mother's family owned that land before you ever set foot in Wyoming territory. You married into it." "Gentlemen," Judge Wilson interrupted. "This is clearly a family matter that has escalated beyond reason. Franklin, do you have these alleged transfer documents with you?" Franklin hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket to produce several folded papers. "I was bringing these for your approval, Judge. Perfectly legal transfer of title. The boy's name was included by mistake in some older documents." Judge Wilson took the papers and examined them carefully. Matthew watched as the judge's expression shifted from concern to suspicion. "Franklin, these signatures." He looked up sharply. "This isn't Martha's handwriting. I knew your wife for 15 years before her passing." A flicker of unease crossed Franklin's face. "She was ill when she signed them. Her hand wasn't steady." She was dead, Matthew said flatly. The date on those papers is 3 years after her death. The room fell silent as the implications of Matthew's accusations sank in. Forgery was a serious crime in Wyoming territory, especially when it involved land transactions. "Sheriff," Judge Wilson said gravely, "I believe we need to investigate these documents further before any actions are taken regarding property rights. This is outrageous." Franklin slammed his fist on the judge's desk. "I won't stand here and be accused by my own flesh and blood. You tried to kill me this morning," Matthew said quietly. "You're no father to me." The judge raised his hands. "Until this matter is settled, I'm issuing an order that neither of you take any action regarding the ranch property. No sales, no transfers, no improvements. The land stays exactly as it is until legal ownership is determined." Franklin's face contorted with rage. "You can't do that. There's gold on that land, and the Blackstone Mining Company has offered." He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. "Gold," Judge Wilson repeated, his eyebrows rising. "This is the first I've heard of gold on Jenkins' land." Matthew stared at his father in dawning comprehension. "So that's it. You'd sell Mother's land, our family's future, to mining interests who'll strip it bare. You're a fool, just like she was," Franklin spat. "Sentimentality doesn't feed you when the winters are hard." The sheriff stepped between them as Matthew moved toward his father. "That's enough, both of you. Franklin Jenkins, I'm confiscating these documents as evidence. Judge Wilson will determine their validity." Franklin straightened his coat, his composure returning like a mask sliding into place. "Very well. But remember, Sheriff, my son threatened me with a gun this morning. I expect that matter to be addressed as well." "I never drew on you," Matthew protested. "Your word against mine, boy," Franklin replied with a cold smile. "And I've got 30 years of reputation in this territory that says mine is worth more." With that, he strode from the office, leaving Matthew seething in his wake. Judge Wilson sighed heavily. "Matthew, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I find it hard to believe you draw on your own father, but these are serious accusations on both sides." "Judge, my father has changed since they found gold. The man who raised me would never have done this." "Gold changes men," the judge said sadly. "I've seen it before. Stay in town for a few days while I look into these documents, and Matthew, watch your back. If what you're saying is true, there's more at stake here than just family pride." Matthew left the courthouse with a heavy heart, uncertain of where to go. The ranch had been his home his entire life, but returning there now seemed dangerous. His father's betrayal had left him effectively homeless, with only his horse, the clothes on his back, and a few dollars in his pocket. As he stood contemplating his next move, a familiar voice called his name. Violetta Ardell was emerging from the town's small library, several books tucked under her arm. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, approaching him. "You look like a man who's received unwelcome news." Despite himself, Matthew felt a small smile tug at his lips. "Miss Ardell, you have a talent for understatement." She fell into step beside him as he began walking toward the livery stable. "Would it help to talk about it? I've been told I'm a good listener, an essential quality for a schoolteacher." Matthew hesitated, then found himself relating the morning's events to this woman he barely knew. There was something about her direct gaze and thoughtful expression that invited confidence. "So you're saying your father falsified documents to steal your inheritance because gold was discovered on your family's land?" she summarized when he finished. "That's the long and short of it," Matthew confirmed. "And now I can't go home because the man who taught me how to shoot might decide to practice what he preached." Violetta was silent for a moment, considering his predicament. "Where will you stay?" Matthew gestured vaguely toward the livery. "I've slept under the stars plenty of times." "Won't be the first or last." "Nonsense," she said decisively. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house mentioned she has vacant rooms. You'll stay there while this is resolved." "Miss Ardell, Violetta," she corrected firmly. "Violetta," he amended. "I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your problem." Perhaps not, she agreed, but I've always believed that civilization is built on people helping one another through difficult times. Besides, I find myself curious about how this story ends. There was something refreshing about her forthrightness that cut through Matthew's usual reserve. Before he knew it, he was accompanying her to the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway, a cheerful widow in her 50s, was delighted to rent him a room. "It's just down the hall from Miss Ardell's," Mrs. Holloway informed him with a knowing twinkle in her eye that made both Matthew and Violetta flush slightly. "Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Jenkins and I are merely acquaintances," Violetta clarified, her tone professional but her cheeks distinctly pink. "Of course, dear," the older woman replied, not looking convinced in the slightest. "Dinner is at 6 sharp. Don't be late, or Mr. Daniels will have claimed all the biscuits." As they climbed the stairs to see his room, Matthew found himself studying Violetta with new interest. What brings a clearly educated Eastern woman to a frontier town like Riverside? Surely there were teaching positions closer to civilization. She smiled enigmatically. "Perhaps I wanted an adventure, or perhaps, like many who come west, I was leaving something behind." Before he could inquire further, they reached his room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. "It's not what you're accustomed to, I imagine," Violetta said. "It has a roof and 4 walls, which is more than I was expecting an hour ago," Matthew replied. "Thank you for your help, though it remains a mystery why you'd extend it to a stranger." She regarded him thoughtfully. "When I arrived in Riverside this morning, I asked myself what kind of place I'd come to. Then I met a man who'd been shot by his own father, yet still conducted himself with dignity and restraint. It gave me hope that I'd made the right decision in coming here." With that, she bid him good afternoon and continued down the hall to her own room, leaving Matthew to wonder what exactly she was hoping to find in Riverside and what she might have been leaving behind. The following days established a strange new routine for Matthew. Each morning, he would check with Judge Wilson about progress on the investigation into the forged documents. The judge had sent inquiries to the territorial capital in Cheyenne, seeking records of the original land grant to Martha Jenkins' family and verification of her will. "These things take time," Judge Wilson cautioned when Matthew grew impatient. "Especially with the Blackstone Mining Company throwing their weight around, they've suddenly taken a keen interest in the case." "What does that mean?" Matthew asked, uneasy. "It means tread carefully," the judge advised. "Companies like Blackstone have deep pockets and friends in high places. They want that gold, Matthew, and they don't much care who legally owns the land if they can get it by other means." This warning was reinforced when Matthew encountered 2 unfamiliar men outside the general store, their city clothes marking them as outsiders. They studied him with calculated interest before approaching. "Mr. Jenkins," the taller of the 2 inquired. "My name is Howard Phillips, and this is my associate, Mr. Graves. We represent the Blackstone Mining Company." Matthew nodded cautiously. "Gentlemen, we understand you're involved in a land dispute with your father," Phillips continued smoothly. "Most unfortunate, family conflicts can be so." "Messy? What's your interest in my family's affairs?" Matthew asked bluntly. Phillips smiled thinly. "Our company has a standing offer to purchase the Jenkins Ranch, a very generous offer. Your father seemed quite amenable until this legal entanglement arose." "That legal entanglement is attempted theft of my inheritance," Matthew corrected. "And the ranch isn't for sale, regardless of who ends up with clear title." Graves spoke for the first time, his voice soft but menacing. "You might want to reconsider that position, Mr. Jenkins. Mining operations will proceed in that area with or without your cooperation. Your father understands the practicalities of the situation." "Is that a threat?" "Merely an observation of economic realities," Phillips interjected smoothly. "Should you eventually secure rights to the property, our offer remains open, though not indefinitely." "Good day, Mr. Jenkins." As they walked away, Matthew felt a prickle of unease. The Blackstone Mining Company's reputation for aggressive business tactics was well known throughout the territory. If they wanted his family's land badly enough, legal ownership might not matter much to them in the end. His concerns were momentarily forgotten that evening when he joined the boarding house residents for dinner. Mrs. Holloway presided over a table that included Mr. Daniels, the telegraph operator, the widow Perkins, who owned the millinery shop, and Violetta, who was discussing her plans for organizing the schoolhouse. "The building is sound," she was saying, "but completely bereft of books beyond a few tattered primers and a Bible. I've written to my former school in Boston requesting donations. Seems to me rating and ciphering is all these children need," Mr. Daniels opined around a mouthful of potatoes. "Anything more is just putting on airs." Violetta's eyes flashed. "Education isn't putting on airs, Mr. Daniels. It's the foundation of a civilized society and the great equalizer between those born to privilege and those born without." "Well said, Miss Ardell," the widow Perkins approved. "My Albert always said much the same before the fever took him." Matthew found himself admiring Violetta's passion. In the week since he'd met her, he'd learned that beneath her composed exterior lay a fierce intelligence and unwavering principles. She spoke her mind but listened carefully to others, a rare combination in his experience. After dinner, they often sat together on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. These quiet conversations had quickly become the highlight of Matthew's day. "Tell me about your ranch," Violetta prompted one evening as they watched a thunderstorm roll across the plains. "You speak of it with such longing." Matthew described the sprawling property with its lush pastures fed by mountain streams, the sturdy house his grandfather had built, and the magnificent views of the Bighorn Mountains. As he spoke, he realized how deeply the land was woven into his identity. "It's more than just property," he concluded. "It's my heritage, my mother's legacy." "And what would you do with it if the judge rules in your favor?" Violetta asked. "Raise horses," Matthew replied without hesitation, "the finest in the territory. My father always focused on cattle, but I've got 3 mares with bloodlines that could build something special." "You didn't consider a different life? Perhaps in a city or—" "No," he said simply. "The land is in my blood. I could no more abandon it than stop breathing." Violetta smiled thoughtfully. "I envy that certainty, to know so clearly where you belong. And you don't feel that way about teaching." "Teaching, yes," she agreed, "but the where has always been flexible." Something in her tone suggested deeper waters, but before Matthew could inquire further, the boarding house door opened and Sheriff Barnes stepped onto the porch. "Matthew," he said gravely, "I need you to come with me. There's been trouble at your ranch." Matthew's heart lurched. "What kind of trouble?" "Fire," the sheriff replied. "The main house is gone." The journey to the Jenkins ranch was made in tense silence, Matthew's mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. They arrived just before dawn to find the charred skeleton of the family home smoldering against the lightening sky. The barn and other outbuildings remained untouched, but the house, the place where he had been born, where generations of his family had lived, was reduced to ash and blackened timbers. Franklin Jenkins stood amid the ruins, his face smoke-stained and grim. When he saw Matthew approaching, his expression hardened. "Come to survey your handiwork," he demanded. Matthew reined his horse to a stop, shock giving way to anger. "My handiwork? You think I did this?" "Who else would want to destroy what I've built?" Sheriff Barnes intervened before Matthew could respond. "Franklin, we don't know what caused the fire yet. Making accusations won't help matters." "I know what I know," Franklin insisted stubbornly. "Boy's been threatening me since I caught him trying to steal those papers." Matthew dismounted, approaching his father with controlled fury. "I would never burn down our family home, no matter what you've done. This was Mother's house." For just a moment, something flickered in Franklin's eyes, a shadow of grief quickly masked by renewed anger. "Convenient for you to remember her now. Where were you when the fire started?" At the boarding house in town with a dozen witnesses, Matthew replied coldly. Where were you? In the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, Franklin said. By the time I saw the flames, it was too late. Sheriff Barnes looked between them, then walked toward the ruins. Was anything taken, any signs of intruders? Franklin hesitated before answering. My safe was broken open. Some cash and papers are missing. Matthew exchanged a glance with the sheriff. This new information cast a different light on the situation. What papers were in that safe? Matthew asked. None of your concern, Franklin snapped. Were they the original land deeds? Matthew pressed. The ones that would prove your forgery. Franklin's hand moved toward his gun before he caught himself, aware of the sheriff watching. Get off my property. Our property, Matthew corrected. Not for long, his father replied with sudden, chilling confidence. Not for long at all. As they rode back to town, Sheriff Barnes shared his suspicions. This doesn't feel like a random fire, Matthew. Someone wanted those documents destroyed. Or stolen, Matthew suggested. Either way, it benefits my father and the Blackstone Mining Company. The sheriff nodded grimly. I'll send a wire to the territorial marshal. This case just got more complicated. When they reached Riverside, Matthew was surprised to see Violetta waiting anxiously outside the sheriff's office. Relief washed over her face when she spotted him. Thank heavens, she breathed. When I heard about the fire, I feared the worst. Her concern touched something deep in Matthew's chest. The house is gone, but I'm all right. I've been thinking, Violetta said as they walked back to the boarding house. The school board has allocated funds for teaching materials. I could use some of that money to purchase law books that might help your case. Matthew stopped walking, genuinely moved by her offer. You do that for me? The school needs law books anyway, she said with forced casualness. For the older students to understand civic responsibilities. Violetta, he said softly, you're a terrible liar. A smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps, but I'm an excellent researcher. If there's legal precedent that could help your case, I'll find it. Matthew impulsively took her hand. Why are you helping me like this? Her eyes met his, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. Because when I first arrived in Riverside, you were kind to me without expecting anything in return. That's rare in my experience. Before Matthew could respond, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A crowd had gathered outside the telegraph office where Mr. Daniels was posting an announcement on the community board. What's happening? Matthew asked a passerby. Land auction. The man replied excitedly. The Jenkins ranch is being sold in parcels next week by order of the territorial governor. Matthew felt the ground shift beneath him. That's impossible. The ownership is under dispute. He pushed through the crowd to read the notice, Violetta close behind. The announcement was official, bearing the territorial seal. Due to unpaid taxes and disputed ownership, the Jenkins property would be divided and auctioned to the highest bidders. The first bidding rights would go to the Blackstone Mining Company in recognition of their significant contributions to territorial development. This is wrong, Violetta said fiercely. They can't do this while the case is unresolved. Matthew was already striding toward Judge Wilson's office, his expression thunderous. He found the judge at his desk, looking as shocked by the announcement as Matthew felt. I had no knowledge of this, Judge Wilson insisted, examining the official order. This came directly from Governor Warren's office, bypassing local jurisdiction entirely. Can he do that? The judge removed his spectacles wearily. He shouldn't be able to, but with enough political pressure and the right connections, I'm afraid he has. Blackstone, Matthew said grimly. They're behind this. Almost certainly, the judge agreed, and they've moved faster than I anticipated. I'm sorry, Matthew. I'll send a protest to Cheyenne, but with the auction scheduled for next week, I'm not optimistic. Matthew left the office feeling hollow. Everything his family had built over generations would be carved up and sold to the highest bidder, all because of his father's greed and a mining company's influence. He found Violetta waiting for him outside. What did Judge Wilson say? Matthew relayed the conversation in clipped sentences as they walked aimlessly down the street, eventually finding themselves at the edge of town where the vast Wyoming landscape stretched before them. "So that's it?" Violetta asked, disbelieving. "They can simply take your land through political maneuvering." "Welcome to the frontier," Matthew replied bitterly, "where justice often depends on who has the most money or the biggest gun." Violetta was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with unexpected determination. "No. I refuse to accept that." "It's not about accepting, there must be a way to fight this," she interrupted. "If the governor issued this order based on falsified information like the forged documents, then the order itself is invalid. Proving that in a week is impossible." "Not if we can find your mother's original will," Violetta countered, "or locate witnesses who knew about her intentions for the land." Matthew shook his head. "The will was in my father's safe. If it wasn't destroyed in the fire, then he has it hidden somewhere." "Then we need to find it," she said simply. "Tonight." Matthew stared at her. "You're suggesting we break into my father's property and search for evidence?" "I'm suggesting we retrieve documents that rightfully belong to you," she corrected, "before your birthright is stolen by corrupt men." "It's dangerous," Matthew warned. "My father won't hesitate to shoot intruders." Violetta's chin lifted stubbornly. "Some principles are worth risking everything for, Matthew. I believe this is one of them." As night fell, Matthew found himself leading Violetta along the back trails to the Jenkins ranch, wondering how this proper Boston schoolteacher had convinced him to attempt something so reckless. They left their horses tethered in a stand of cottonwoods and approached the property on foot, keeping to the shadows. The main house was a blackened ruin, but the barn and bunkhouse were intact. Light shone from the bunkhouse window, suggesting Franklin had taken up residence there. "The safe was in Father's study," Matthew whispered. "If anything survived the fire, it would be there." They crept toward the ruins, careful to avoid loose debris that might betray their presence. The acrid smell of burnt wood hung in the air as they picked their way through what remained of the once grand house. The study was in the rear corner, and while its walls were gone, the heavy iron safe remained, scorched but intact. It stood open, its contents apparently removed. "He's already emptied it," Matthew said with quiet despair. "Or someone else did," Violetta suggested. "You mentioned the safe was broken into during the fire." Matthew knelt to examine it more closely. This wasn't broken open, it was unlocked with a key or the combination. A sudden noise from outside froze them both. Voices approached his father's among them. "Assure you, Mr. Phillips, everything is proceeding according to plan," Franklin was saying. "Once Blackstone secures the mining rights, my role as consultant will be formalized." "The governor took considerable political risk with this auction order," replied a voice Matthew recognized as Howard Phillips from the mining company. "He expects results and discretion." "You'll have both," Franklin promised as they entered the bunkhouse. The door closed behind them, muffling their conversation. Matthew and Violetta exchanged glances in the darkness. "We need to hear what they're saying," she whispered. They crept toward the bunkhouse, finding a position beneath an open window where the voices carried. "Original will is secure," Franklin was saying. "No one will find it before the auction." "And your son?" Phillips asked. "He seems determined." "Matthew's always been stubborn like his mother," Franklin replied dismissively, "but without proof he has no legal standing." "And if he tries more direct methods of interference?" There was a pause before Franklin answered. "Then handle it. Just keep my name clear of any unpleasantness." The cold calculation in his father's voice sent a chill through Matthew. This man was not just betraying him, he was potentially sanctioning violence against his own son. "We should go," he whispered to Violetta. "We've heard enough." They retreated silently, but as they neared the edge of the property, a twig snapped under Violetta's foot. Instantly, a lantern flared to life, illuminating them in its harsh glare. "Who's there?" called a gruff voice, one of Franklin's ranch hands. Matthew grabbed Violetta's hand. Run. They sprinted for the cover of trees as a shot rang out behind them, the bullet splintering bark inches from Matthew's head. They didn't stop running until they reached their horses, quickly mounting and galloping into the night. When they were safely away, they slowed to a trot, both breathing hard from the exertion and fear. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked, studying Violetta's face in the moonlight. She nodded, her eyes bright with adrenaline. "We know the will exists. Franklin has hidden it somewhere. But where?" "We have less than a week before the auction." Violetta was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Who would your father trust with something so important? Does he have close associates in town?" Matthew considered the question. "Only one Edgar Simmons at the bank. They've been friends for years." "Then that's where we start tomorrow," Violetta decided. A bank would be the logical place to secure important documents. As they rode back toward town, Matthew found himself marveling at this woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. "You know, most ladies of your upbringing would have fainted at the first gunshot." Violetta laughed softly. "You clearly haven't met many Boston schoolteachers. We face more dangerous situations before breakfast than most cowboys see in a week." "Is that so?" Matthew couldn't help smiling. "Children can be terrifying," she said with mock solemnity, "especially when armed with slates and stubborn questions." Their laughter faded into comfortable silence as they continued toward Riverside. Matthew was acutely aware of her presence beside him, this brave, intelligent woman who had risked her safety to help him fight an injustice. Something was shifting between them, something neither had acknowledged but both could feel. "Violetta," he said finally, "you should know that even if we find the will, this fight could get uglier. Blackstone Mining has powerful friends and few scruples. Being associated with me could damage your reputation in town." She turned to look at him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Matthew, I came west because I was tired of living by other people's expectations. If standing beside you in this fight costs me the good opinion of people who value money over justice, that's a price I'm willing to pay." Her words warmed something in him that had been cold since his father's betrayal. For the first time in days, Matthew felt hope not just for his land, but for something he hadn't known he was missing. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled. "We haven't won yet. Save your thanks for when you have your ranch back." The following morning, they met with Sheriff Barnes, sharing what they had overheard at the ranch. The sheriff listened gravely, taking notes. "This confirms my suspicions about Blackstone's involvement," he said when they finished. "But overhearing a conversation isn't legal evidence of wrongdoing." "What about the will?" Matthew asked. "If we could find it, that would be different," the sheriff agreed. "A valid will would supersede any claims based on forged documents." "But where would your father hide something so important?" "We think the bank," Violetta explained. "Edgar Simmons is Franklin's friend." Sheriff Barnes frowned. "I can't issue a search warrant for the bank based on suspicion alone. Simmons would fight it and we'd lose valuable time." "Then we need another approach," Matthew said. After leaving the sheriff's office, they walked to the town's small bank. Through the window, they could see Edgar Simmons at his desk, a portly man with thinning hair and an officious manner. "He won't simply tell us if he's hiding documents for my father," Matthew observed. "No," Violetta agreed, "but he might tell someone else." She studied the bank thoughtfully. "Mr. Simmons strikes me as a man who enjoys feeling important. The type who might be flattered by attention from the right person." "What are you thinking?" A smile slowly spread across Violetta's face. "I believe it's time for the new schoolteacher to take an interest in Riverside's financial institutions. For educational purposes, of course." An hour later, Violetta entered the bank alone, dressed in her most formal outfit, her hair arranged in an elegant style that emphasized her refined features. Matthew waited across the street, watching through the window as she approached Simmons' desk with a gracious smile. Though he couldn't hear their conversation, Matthew could see Simmons straightening his waistcoat and puffing up with self-importance as Violetta spoke animatedly, gesturing occasionally as if describing something grand. After several minutes, Simmons stood and led her toward the back of the bank, disappearing from view. 20 anxious minutes passed before Violetta emerged, still smiling pleasantly as she bid Simmons goodbye. Her expression remained fixed until she rejoined Matthew in the alley beside the general store. "Well," he asked impatiently. "I explained that I'm organizing a lecture series on frontier economics for the older students," she said, eyes dancing with triumph. Mr. Simmons was delighted to give me a tour of the bank's operations, including the secure storage area where special clients keep private documents. And I saw a strongbox labeled FJ in his private office safe. He didn't open it, of course, but he mentioned that some of Riverside's most prominent citizens entrust their most valuable papers to his care. Matthew's pulse quickened. "That has to be it. But how do we get to it?" Violetta's smile turned mischievous. Mr. Simmons also mentioned that he lives alone above the millinery shop and takes his dinner at the hotel every evening from 7 to 8. He's quite proud of his punctuality. "So the bank is empty during that hour," Matthew concluded. "And I may have noticed where he keeps the keys to his office," Violetta added, pulling a small notepad from her reticule. "Second drawer of his desk beneath a false bottom." Matthew stared at her in amazement. "Miss Ardell, I begin to think there's more to your past than teaching school in Boston." A shadow crossed her face. "Let's just say I learned to be observant out of necessity." Before Matthew could inquire further, they were interrupted by the approach of Howard Phillips and his associate Graves. The mining company men surveyed them with barely disguised hostility. "Mr. Jenkins," Phillips greeted coldly. "Miss Ardell, I understand congratulations are in order. You've secured a teaching position in our little community." "Thank you," Violetta replied with perfect composure. "Though I wasn't aware the mining company had interests in local education." "Blackstone Mining has interests wherever prosperity might be found," Phillips replied smoothly. "Speaking of which, Mr. Jenkins, I hear you had some excitement at your former home last night." "Trespassing is a serious offense." Matthew kept his expression neutral. "I wasn't aware one could trespass on one's own property." "Former property," Graves corrected. "The auction is in 5 days. You would be wise to accept the inevitable." "Nothing is inevitable except death and taxes, Mr. Graves," Violetta interjected pleasantly. "And even taxes can sometimes be negotiated with the right documentation." Phillips studied her with new interest. "You seem unusually invested in Mr. Jenkins' affairs, Miss Ardell." "One might wonder why. One might mind one's own business," she replied, her smile never wavering. "Good day, gentlemen." As they walked away, Matthew muttered, "They know we were at the ranch last night." "Of course they do," Violetta replied quietly, "which means we need to move quickly." Tonight, breaking into the bank after hours was not something Matthew had ever imagined himself doing, yet as darkness fell, he found himself picking the lock on the bank's rear door while Violetta kept watch. The skills he'd learned breaking Mustangs on the ranch had little application to lockpicking, but Violetta had produced a set of slender tools from her boot and demonstrated the technique with surprising expertise. "Where exactly did you learn to do this?" Matthew whispered as the lock finally clicked open. "My father was a locksmith," she replied simply. "Before he wasn't." The cryptic answer raised more questions, but now wasn't the time to ask them. They slipped inside the darkened bank, moving carefully to avoid making noise. Simmons' office was at the rear, its door secured with another lock that Violetta dispatched more quickly than the first. "Find the keys," she whispered, moving to keep watch at the window. Matthew searched the desk, locating the false bottom drawer Violetta had described. Inside, he found a heavy iron key ring with several keys of different sizes. "Got them," he murmured. The office safe was concealed behind a mediocre landscape painting. It took 3 attempts before Matthew found the correct key, and the safe door swung open with a low creak. Inside, among various papers and cash boxes, sat a metal strongbox labeled FJ. Just as Violetta had described, This box required yet another key, but none on the ring fit its lock. "It's not opening," Matthew said, frustration mounting. Violetta joined him, examining the box. "We need to take it with us." "It's too heavy to carry without being noticed," Matthew objected, "and Simmons will know immediately it's missing." Violetta bit her lip, thinking, the documents are what matter, not the box. She reached into her hair and withdrew a long, thin hairpin. "Let me try." With delicate precision, she worked the pin into the lock, her expression one of intense concentration. After several tense minutes, there was a soft click, and the lid lifted. Inside lay several folded papers, including one with a faded wax seal that Matthew recognized immediately. "That's it, my mother's handwriting." He carefully unfolded the document, confirming it was indeed his mother's last will and testament, dated 2 months before her death. The provisions were clear. The Jenkins ranch was to be held jointly by Franklin and Matthew, with Matthew receiving full title upon his 25th birthday or his father's death, whichever came first. "I turned 25 last month," Matthew realized. "That's why he moved now. The ranch was about to legally become mine." "We need to get this to Judge Wilson immediately," Violetta urged. They secured the will inside Matthew's shirt and carefully replaced the strongbox, locking the safe and returning the keys to their hiding place. As they prepared to leave through the rear door, a shadow fell across the window. "Someone's coming," Violetta hissed. They ducked behind Simmons' desk as the front door of the bank opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the main floor, accompanied by the unmistakable voice of Edgar Simmons himself. "I tell you, Franklin, it's safer here than anywhere," he was saying. "No one would dare break into my bank." "Check it anyway," Franklin Jenkins' gruff voice replied. "After last night's incident at the ranch, I'm taking no chances." Matthew and Violetta exchanged alarmed glances. There was no exit from the office except past the approaching men. "Hide," Matthew mouthed, pointing to a large cabinet against the wall. They squeezed inside just as the office door opened, Simmons' portly figure silhouetted against the lamplight from the main room. "See." "Everything's secure," Simmons said, gesturing around the undisturbed office. Franklin stepped past him, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the room. "Check the safe." "Really, Franklin, this is excessive." "Check it," Franklin repeated firmly. With a put-upon sigh, Simmons moved the painting and unlocked the safe. "There, all your precious papers, right where you left them." Franklin approached the safe, examining the strongbox. Matthew held his breath, certain his father would notice it had been tampered with. But after a moment, Franklin nodded, apparently satisfied. "Very well. But I want you to move these documents to Cheyenne tomorrow to your company's main office. They're too important to risk." "If you insist," Simmons agreed reluctantly. Though I still think a sudden commotion from the street interrupted him, shouting and the sound of running feet. Both men moved to the window. "Fire," came a distant cry. "The schoolhouse is burning," Violetta gasped softly beside Matthew, her hand flying to her mouth. "We should go see," Simmons said. "The new schoolteacher will be devastated." The men hurried from the bank, leaving the door ajar in their haste. Matthew and Violetta emerged from their hiding place, rushing to the window to see flames rising from the small building at the end of the street where Violetta had been preparing her classroom. "My books," she whispered, anguished. "All the supplies." "We need to go," Matthew urged, pulling her toward the rear door. "This might be our only chance to escape unnoticed." They slipped out into the night, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward Judge Wilson's house on the outskirts of town. Most of Riverside's citizens were gathered around the burning schoolhouse, forming a bucket brigade that seemed woefully inadequate against the ferocious blaze. Judge Wilson answered his door in a nightshirt, looking alarmed at their disheveled appearance. "Matthew, Miss Ardell." "What in heaven's name? We have proof," Matthew interrupted, producing the will from inside his shirt. "My mother's original will. It gives me full ownership of the ranch as of my 25th birthday last month." The judge quickly ushered them inside, examining the document under his reading lamp. "This appears authentic," he confirmed after several minutes. "The seal and signatures are in order, but where did you get it?" Matthew and Violetta exchanged glances. "Perhaps it's better you don't know the specifics, Judge," Violetta suggested diplomatically. Judge Wilson looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see. Well, in any case, this is the evidence we need to halt the auction. I'll send a rider to Cheyenne first thing in the morning with an emergency injunction." "That may not be soon enough," Matthew cautioned, explaining what they'd overheard about moving the documents to Cheyenne. The judge frowned. "This complicates matters. If Blackstone's influence in the territorial capital is as strong as we suspect, even this will might be lost before it can be presented to the proper authorities." "Then what can we do?" Violetta asked. Judge Wilson thought for a moment. "We need to make this too public to be swept under the carpet. The territorial newspaper in Cheyenne has been investigating corruption in land deals. If they published this story—" "How do we get it to them in time?" Matthew asked. "I have a friend who works as a reporter there," Violetta said suddenly. "From my time in Boston, he moved west last year. If I could telegraph him tonight—" "The telegraph office is closed," Judge Wilson pointed out. "Mr. Daniels has a key," Matthew remembered. "And he owes me a favor for helping with his roof last summer." Within the hour, they had convinced the sleepy telegraph operator to send an urgent message to Violetta's contact at the Cheyenne Daily Tribune, outlining the situation and promising documentation to follow. It was a desperate gamble, but their options were dwindling. Dawn was breaking when they finally returned to the boarding house, exhausted but hopeful. As they reached the front porch, Violetta paused, gazing toward the smoldering remains of the schoolhouse. Why would someone burn it? She wondered aloud. It makes no sense. Matthew considered the timing. Unless it was a distraction to get everyone away from the bank while my father and Simmons checked on the documents. Violetta's eyes widened. "You think they knew we were planning to look for the will?" "Maybe not specifically, but they might have suspected we were getting close," Matthew reasoned. "The fire was convenient timing." "Those poor children," Violetta said sadly. "They've lost their chance at an education because of your father's greed." Matthew took her hand impulsively. "Not if we stop him. And when this is over, I'll help you rebuild the schoolhouse better than before." She looked up at him, surprise and something warmer in her expression. "You would do that?" "Violetta," he said quietly, "you've risked everything to help me, your reputation, your safety, even your livelihood. Why wouldn't I do the same for you?" The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Slowly, Matthew leaned closer, drawn by an irresistible pull. Violetta's eyes fluttered closed as their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with shared emotion and relief at having survived the night's dangers. When they finally parted, Violetta's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. We should get some rest," she murmured. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Matthew nodded, reluctant to break the spell between them but knowing she was right. "Good night, Violetta." "Good morning, actually," she corrected with a small smile, glancing at the lightening sky before disappearing inside. Matthew stood on the porch for a long moment afterward, marveling at how this woman had upended his life in the space of a week, and how he couldn't imagine facing what lay ahead without her by his side. The following day brought new complications. Word spread through Riverside that Governor Warren himself would be attending the auction, a clear indication of its political importance. Meanwhile, Franklin Jenkins and the Blackstone representatives were seen in deep conversation outside the bank, their expressions grim. "They've discovered the will is missing," Violetta guessed as she and Matthew observed from the window of the general store. "Look at how agitated Simmons appears." She was right, the banker was gesticulating frantically, his face flushed with distress. Their telegraph to Cheyenne had received a promising response. Violetta's journalist friend, Robert Clark, had expressed immediate interest in the story and promised to arrive in Riverside the day before the auction with a photographer to document the proceedings. If the governor sees his corrupt dealings about to be exposed in the territorial newspaper, he might reconsider his position, Judge Wilson suggested when they shared this news. Or he might double down, Sheriff Barnes countered pessimistically. Politicians hate nothing more than being caught in their own schemes. The tension in town increased as auction day approached. Additional Blackstone employees arrived, taking rooms at the hotel and establishing a visible presence on Riverside streets. Matthew noticed several of them watching the boarding house, making no effort to conceal their surveillance. "They're trying to intimidate us," he told Violetta as they took their customary evening walk, now accompanied by Sheriff Barnes as a precaution. "Then they don't know us very well," she replied with determination. "I've faced worse than hired thugs in my time." Matthew studied her curiously. "You keep alluding to a past that sounds far more adventurous than teaching school in Boston. Will you ever tell me the full story?" Violetta was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I suppose you deserve to know, given everything we've been through together." She glanced at the sheriff walking several paces ahead, then continued in a lower voice. "My father wasn't just a locksmith. He was a safecracker, one of the best in New England." "A thief?" Matthew asked, surprised. "He preferred security consultant," Violetta said with a wry smile. "He tested bank security systems by breaking into them, then showing the banks their vulnerabilities for a fee, of course. It was legitimate work, mostly. Mostly? Sometimes the line between legitimate security work and other opportunities became blurred," she admitted. "When I was 16, he was arrested for stealing bearer bonds from a bank in Hartford. He died in prison 2 years later." Matthew absorbed this revelation. "And you?" "I was determined to create a different life," she said simply. "I worked as a maid for a professor's family to pay for teacher training. When I graduated, I took the position farthest from my past that I could find, Riverside." She nodded. "I never imagined I'd be using my father's less reputable teachings so soon after arriving." A hint of uncertainty crept into her voice. "Does this change how you see me?" Matthew considered her question seriously. This elegant, principled woman had revealed layers he hadn't expected, yet somehow they only made her more remarkable in his eyes. "It changes nothing," he assured her, taking her hand. "Except perhaps it explains your impressive lock-picking skills." Her relieved laugh warmed his heart, and they continued their walk in comfortable silence, hands still linked. The day before the auction, Robert Clark arrived from Cheyenne as promised, accompanied by a solemn young man carrying a bulky camera. The journalist was older than Matthew had expected, in his 50s, with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors despite his profession. "Miss Ardell," he greeted Violetta warmly when they met at the boarding house. "You're looking well. The frontier agrees with you." "It's good to see you, Robert," she replied. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." A conspiracy involving the governor, a mining company, and a land-grabbing father. Clark's eyes gleamed with professional enthusiasm. "I'd have crawled here on my knees for a story like that." They spent the afternoon reviewing the evidence. The original will, Judge Wilson's sworn statement regarding the forged documents, and Matthew's account of the events leading to his father's betrayal. Clark took copious notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is dynamite," he declared finally. "If we can document the auction proceedings tomorrow, especially if the governor attends personally, we'll have enough for a front-page exposé that could shake the territorial government." "Will that be enough to stop the auction?" Matthew asked. Clark's expression grew serious. "That depends on how badly the governor wants to avoid scandal, but at minimum it should force a legal review of the proceedings, which would buy time for the will to be properly authenticated." Their planning session was interrupted by Mrs. Holloway, who entered with a troubled expression. "Mr. Jenkins, there are men outside asking for you. They don't look friendly." Matthew moved to the window. 4 rough-looking men in Blackstone Company coats stood on the street, their postures suggesting they weren't leaving without a confrontation. "They're trying to prevent you from attending the auction," Clark surmised. "Classic intimidation tactic." "What should we do?" Violetta asked. Sheriff Barnes, who had been listening silently in the corner, stood. "I'll handle this." He checked his revolver before heading outside, his badge prominently displayed. They watched through the window as the sheriff confronted the Blackstone men. Words were exchanged, too distant to hear clearly, but the men eventually dispersed, casting dark glances toward the boarding house as they departed. "They'll be back," Sheriff Barnes reported when he returned. "And next time they might not be so easily discouraged. I suggest you all stay inside until morning." That night, Matthew found sleep elusive. The knowledge that tomorrow would determine not just his future but his entire legacy weighed heavily on him. Around midnight, a soft knock on his door revealed Violetta, similarly unable to rest. "I thought you might want company," she said, stepping into his room and closing the door behind her in the dim lamplight. Her beauty struck him anew, not just her physical appearance, but the strength and intelligence that animated her features. Without the constraints of corsets and formal attire, dressed simply in a modest nightgown with a shawl around her shoulders, she seemed both more vulnerable and more real. "I keep thinking about what happens after tomorrow," Matthew admitted as they sat together by the window, watching for any signs of trouble outside. If I get the ranch back, what then?" "Then you build the life you want," Violetta said simply. "Raise your horses, work your land, create something lasting. And you," he asked, studying her face. "Will you rebuild the schoolhouse and continue teaching here?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Until this week I thought I knew exactly what my path forward looked like. Now." He prompted when she fell silent. Violetta met his gaze directly. "Now I find myself considering possibilities I hadn't imagined before coming to Riverside." The air between them seemed charged with potential. Matthew reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Violetta, when this is over, I want a gunshot crack the night air, followed by the sound of breaking glass from downstairs." They jumped to their feet as shouts erupted in the street. "Fire! The boarding house is on fire!" Smoke began seeping under the door as Matthew grabbed his boots and gun. "We need to get out." They rushed into the hallway to find other residents emerging from their rooms in panic. Flames were already climbing the staircase from the first floor, blocking their escape route, the back stairs. Mrs. Holloway cried, directing everyone toward the servants' staircase at the rear of the building. Matthew helped the elderly widow Perkins navigate the narrow steps while Violetta guided Mr. Daniels, who was disoriented from sleep. Outside, they gathered in the alley behind the boarding house, watching in horror as the flames consumed the wooden structure with terrifying speed. "This is no accident," Sheriff Barnes declared, arriving breathless from his office down the street. "Someone shot a flaming arrow through the front window. I saw them riding away." Robert Clark emerged from the hotel across the street, camera in hand. "I'm documenting everything," he assured them grimly. "This attack won't go unreported." As the townspeople formed a bucket brigade to prevent the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings, Matthew spotted a familiar figure observing from the shadows his father, expression unreadable in the flickering light. Their eyes locked across the chaos, and in that moment, Matthew saw something unexpected in his father's face, not triumph or satisfaction, but a flicker of what might have been regret. Then Franklin turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. "Everyone's accounted for except your photographer," Sheriff Barnes informed Clark after taking a head count. The journalist looked alarmed. "Timothy was developing plates in his hotel room. He wouldn't have heard the commotion." A quick check revealed that the young photographer was indeed still working in his room, oblivious to the drama unfolding outside. His relief at finding his companion safe was evident, as was his excitement at having preserved the photographic evidence they'd gathered. "What now?" Violetta asked as they gathered in Judge Wilson's home, where he had offered temporary shelter to those displaced by the fire. They've destroyed the boarding house. They'll stop at nothing to prevent us from attending the auction. Which means we must be there, Matthew said firmly. If we hide now, they win. Dawn broke over Riverside with an eerie calm. The auction was scheduled for noon at the courthouse, and by mid-morning, wagons and carriages were arriving from neighboring towns and ranches. The street outside the courthouse filled with prospective buyers, many openly affiliated with the Blackstone Mining Company. Matthew, Violetta, Clark, and Timothy approached from Judge Wilson's house, accompanied by the sheriff. They had decided on a public approach, believing safety lay in visibility. If Blackstone attempted further violence in front of so many witnesses, their desperation would be clear to all. The courthouse steps were guarded by territorial marshals, their presence indicating the governor's anticipated arrival. Inside, the main courtroom had been arranged with rows of chairs facing the judge's bench, where the auctioneer would conduct the proceedings. Matthew and his companions took seats near the front, ignoring the hostile glances from Blackstone representatives scattered throughout the room. Franklin Jenkins sat on the opposite side, flanked by Edgar Simmons and Howard Phillips. At precisely noon, the door at the rear of the courtroom opened to admit Governor Warren, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He acknowledged the crowd with a practiced politician's smile before taking a seat in a specially prepared chair near the auctioneer's podium. Timothy discreetly positioned his camera to capture the scene as Judge Wilson entered and called the room to order. "Before we proceed with today's auction," the judge announced, "I must address a legal matter that has been brought to my attention." A murmur ran through the crowd as the judge continued. It has been alleged that the documents establishing ownership of the Jenkins property, which is to be auctioned today, may have been falsified. Furthermore, an original has been located that contradicts the ownership claims upon which this auction is based. Governor Warren's smile faltered as he leaned over to whisper urgently to an aide. Howard Phillips half rose from his seat, his face darkening with anger while Franklin Jenkins remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "I hold in my hand," Judge Wilson continued, holding up Martha Jenkins' will, "a legally executed last testament that grants ownership of the property in question to Matthew Jenkins as of his 25th birthday, which occurred last month. This document bears proper witnesses and seals and appears to be authentic." "Objection," Phillips called out. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. The auction has been properly authorized by territorial decree." "Based on potentially fraudulent information," the judge countered. "As a court of law, I cannot in good conscience proceed with an auction that may deprive a citizen of his rightful property." Governor Warren stood, his political instincts clearly sensing danger. "Judge Wilson, may I speak with you privately before you make any ruling that might delay these proceedings?" "You may not, Governor," the judge replied firmly. "This is a matter of law, not politics." Robert Clark was scribbling furiously in his notebook, while Timothy's camera clicked at strategic moments, capturing the growing tension in the room. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson continued, "I have received sworn statements regarding attempts to intimidate witnesses in this case, including the burning of the schoolhouse and boarding house in what appears to be related to this property dispute." This announcement sent another shock wave through the audience. Several prominent citizens of Riverside exchanged alarmed glances, clearly hearing this connection for the first time. Matthew rose to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may address the court," the judge nodded permission. "My father and I disagree on many things," Matthew began, looking directly at Franklin, "but I never thought he would resort to violence and fraud to take what rightfully belongs to both of us. The ranch has been in our family for generations. It's more than just land, it's a legacy my mother wanted preserved." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I don't believe my father acted alone in this. The sudden interest of the Blackstone Mining Company in our property, coinciding with my 25th birthday and the discovery of gold, suggests a conspiracy that extends beyond a family disagreement. Howard Phillips shot to his feet. These are outrageous accusations. The Blackstone Mining Company operates with the highest ethical standards, like burning down a schoolhouse, Violetta interrupted, standing beside Matthew. Or a boarding house with people sleeping inside. Are those your highest ethical standards, Mr. Phillips? The room erupted in overlapping voices as accusations flew. Governor Warren, clearly sensing the political winds shifting, raised his hands for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, please. These are serious allegations that deserve proper investigation. Perhaps it would be prudent to postpone the auction until these matters can be resolved through appropriate legal channels. It was a political retreat, thinly disguised as concern for proper procedure, but it was exactly what Matthew and his allies had hoped for. As the governor continued speaking, Matthew became aware of movement beside him. His father had approached silently and now stood at his shoulder, expression grim but resolute. "Son," Franklin said quietly, "we need to talk." Surprise kept Matthew momentarily silent. After everything that had happened, his father's calm approach seemed surreal. "I think we're past talking," he replied coldly. "Maybe," Franklin acknowledged, "but there are things you should know about the mining company, about what they promised, and what they threatened." Before Matthew could respond, Howard Phillips noticed their conversation and hurried toward them, alarm evident in his features. "Franklin, what are you doing?" "What I should have done weeks ago," Franklin replied, turning to face Phillips. "Tell the truth." Phillips' hand moved inside his jacket, and Matthew reacted instinctively, shoving his father aside as a pistol appeared in Phillips' hand. Women screamed as the shot rang out in the crowded courtroom, the bullet splintering the wooden railing where Franklin had stood moments before. Sheriff Barnes drew his weapon, but before he could fire, Franklin Jenkins had produced his own revolver and shot Phillips squarely in the shoulder. The mining company man crumpled to the floor, his gun clattering away across the polished boards. "Father." Matthew exclaimed, stunned by Franklin's intervention. "He would have killed you," Franklin said simply. "Whatever else I've done, I wouldn't let that happen." As the sheriff and his deputies restored order, taking Phillips into custody and clearing the panicked crowd, Franklin turned back to Matthew. "I made a terrible mistake, son. The gold, it clouded my judgment, but I never authorized violence, the fires, the threats. That was all Blackstone trying to protect their investment. You shot me," Matthew reminded him, unable to forgive so easily. "I aimed to wound, not kill," Franklin admitted. "I wanted to scare you off, make you leave before things got worse. Phillips made it clear what would happen if I backed out of our arrangement. So you chose them over me, over Mother's wishes." Franklin's weathered face showed genuine regret. "Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. When I saw the boarding house burning last night, I realized how far they were willing to go. I couldn't bear having your blood on my hands, whatever the cost." Governor Warren approached them, his political smile firmly back in place despite the chaos. "Mr. Jenkins, both Mr. Jenkinses, I believe we should discuss this situation privately. There may be a resolution that satisfies all parties." "There's only one resolution that satisfies justice, Governor," Judge Wilson interjected, joining them. "Recognition of the legitimate will and Matthew's rightful ownership of the property." Of course," the governor agreed hastily, eyeing Robert Clark's notebook and Timothy's camera nervously. "I merely thought we might discuss how to handle the gold situation. The territory has significant interest in developing its natural resources, after all." Matthew looked between the governor, the judge, and his father, understanding the negotiation being proposed. "The gold belongs to whoever owns the land," he said firmly. "According to my mother's will, that's me," Franklin nodded slowly. "He's right, Governor, the ranch is rightfully his." "Then perhaps a state-authorized mining lease," the governor suggested, "with appropriate compensation to the landowner naturally." Much more lucrative than ranching, I assure you. Matthew considered the proposal. I'll think about it, but any arrangement would need to preserve the ranch itself, no strip mining that destroys the pastures or pollutes the streams. Completely understandable, the governor agreed, relief evident in his voice at finding a potential compromise that wouldn't result in embarrassing newspaper headlines. As the negotiations continued, Violetta stepped to Matthew's side, taking his hand supportively. "Are you all right?" She asked softly. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Everything's happening so fast." She studied his face, reading the conflict there. "Your father saved your life." "After endangering it in the first place," Matthew pointed out. "Yes," she agreed. "But perhaps it's a chance to rebuild what was broken between you. Not forgiveness, necessarily, but understanding." Matthew glanced at his father, who was now explaining something to Judge Wilson with evident remorse. The anger that had driven him for the past weeks hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making space for more complicated emotions. "You think I should try to reconcile with him," Matthew said. "I think family is precious," Violetta replied carefully. "Even flawed family. My father made terrible choices, but he loved me in his way. I wish we'd had the chance to find our way back to each other before he died." Her words resonated with Matthew, touching on fears he'd barely acknowledged of ending up alone, of losing his last connection to his past and his mother's memory. "I don't know if I can trust him again," Matthew said honestly. "Trust is earned," Violetta agreed. "But perhaps it can be rebuilt, with time and effort on both sides." The aftermath of the courthouse confrontation unfolded over the following days with surprising speed. Governor Warren, eager to distance himself from the scandal, publicly praised Judge Wilson's commitment to justice and ordered an investigation into Blackstone Mining Company's business practices throughout the territory. Howard Phillips faced charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, while his associates scattered, unwilling to be caught in the widening investigation. Robert Clark's front-page story in the Cheyenne Daily Tribune detailed the entire affair, carefully attributing the most damning allegations to sources close to the investigation, rather than to Matthew or Violetta directly. Franklin Jenkins made a full statement to Sheriff Barnes, admitting to forging documents, but maintaining he had not authorized or participated in the attacks on the schoolhouse and boarding house. His testimony implicated Phillips and Blackstone executives in a broader scheme to acquire mineral rights throughout the territory through questionable means. "What will happen to him?" Violetta asked when Judge Wilson shared this information with them. "He'll face charges for the forgery," the judge explained, "but his cooperation against Blackstone will likely result in a reduced sentence, perhaps a fine rather than imprisonment." Matthew received this news with mixed emotions. The thought of his father in prison disturbed him more than he had expected, despite everything that had happened between them. 3 days after the aborted auction, Matthew rode out to the ranch for the first time since the confrontation with his father. The charred remains of the main house stood as a stark reminder of all that had been lost, but the land itself remained the rolling pastures, clear streams, and distant mountain views that had been his family's legacy for generations. To his surprise, he found Franklin working in the barn, mending tack with the same methodical precision he had taught Matthew as a boy. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," Matthew said from the doorway. Franklin looked up, his hand stilling on the leather reins he was repairing. "Judge Wilson released me on my own recognizance until the hearing next month. I thought I might as well make myself useful." An awkward silence stretched between them, decades of complicated history and recent betrayal making simple conversation impossible. Finally, Franklin spoke again. "I started clearing the house site, thought you might want to rebuild come spring." "I haven't decided yet," Matthew replied honestly. Franklin nodded, accepting this uncertainty. "Whatever you choose, the ranch is yours now. I won't contest it further." "Why did you do it, Father?" Matthew asked, the question that had haunted him since that morning when everything changed. Was it just the gold? Or was there something else, something between you and Mother I never understood? Franklin set aside his work, considering his answer carefully. The gold was part of it, he admitted. But not all. He sighed heavily, looking suddenly older than his years. Your mother and I, we loved each other, but we wanted different things from this land. She saw it as a heritage to preserve, something beautiful to pass on unchanged. I saw it as an opportunity, a chance to build something greater than what we inherited. And when the gold was discovered, I convinced myself I was fulfilling my vision, creating something of lasting value, Franklin said. But in truth, I was betraying hers and yours. He met Matthew's gaze directly. I'm not asking your forgiveness, son. What I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know I regret it with every breath. Matthew absorbed his father's words, recognizing the truth in them despite his lingering anger. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, he said honestly. But I don't want to carry this hatred forever. It's too heavy. Franklin nodded, understanding. What will you do now with the ranch, I mean? Rebuild, Matthew decided in that moment. Not exactly as it was, but something that honors Mother's vision while creating something new. He thought of Violetta, of her courage and principles, and added, something that looks toward the future. When Matthew returned to town that evening, he found Violetta outside the ruins of the schoolhouse, surveying the damage with a determined expression. The townspeople had already begun clearing away debris, preparing for reconstruction. Planning your new classroom. He asked, dismounting to join her. Dreaming of possibilities, she corrected with a smile. The town council has approved funds for a larger building, 2 classrooms instead of 1 with a proper library. That's wonderful, Matthew said sincerely. The children of Riverside are fortunate to have you fighting for their education. Violetta studied his face. You seem different today, more settled. I visited the ranch, he explained, spoke with my father. And I've decided to rebuild both the house and perhaps some kind of relationship with him. Not what we had before, but something new. She nodded approvingly. That takes courage. I had a good example, he said, taking her hand. Someone showed me that new beginnings are possible, even after betrayal. Violetta's fingers tightened around his. Does this new beginning include plans for the future, beyond just rebuilding structures? Matthew understood what she was asking. In the chaos of recent events, they hadn't discussed the kiss they'd shared or the feelings growing between them. But he had been thinking about little else whenever the crisis allowed. Violetta, he said, choosing his words carefully, these past weeks have been the strangest of my life. I lost my home, discovered my father's betrayal, and nearly lost everything my family built over generations. A difficult time, she agreed solemnly. And yet, he continued, when I think about what matters most from these weeks, it's not the ranch or the gold or even reconciling with my father. It's you, her eyes widened slightly. Matthew, you stood by me when you had every reason to walk away, he pressed on. You risked everything to help a man you barely knew because it was right. You showed me that family isn't just about blood, it's about who stands beside you when the world falls apart. Tears shimmered in Violetta's eyes as she listened. I haven't had a real family since my father died, she admitted softly. I've been adrift, looking for somewhere to belong. Matthew reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. Then perhaps we can build something together, a home, a family, a future, not to replace what either of us has lost, but to create something new. Are you asking what I think you're asking? She whispered. I'm asking if you might consider staying in Riverside not just as the schoolteacher, but as my wife, Matthew said, his heart pounding. I know it's sudden, yes, she interrupted, her face luminous with joy. Yes, I'll stay, yes, I'll marry you, yes to building a future together. As he gathered her into his arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that promised new beginnings, Violetta whispered against his mouth words that healed something broken inside him. Then I'll be the family you needed, and you'll be mine. 6 months later, the Jenkins ranch had been transformed. A new house stood on the old foundation, larger and more modern than its predecessor, but built with the same sturdy frontier craftsmanship. The barn had been expanded to accommodate Matthew's growing herd of horses, including 3 new brood mares with the bloodlines he'd always dreamed of developing. The gold deposit on the southern pasture was being carefully mined under a controlled lease agreement that preserved the land, while providing income that had allowed Matthew to implement improvements throughout the property. Franklin Jenkins, after paying a substantial fine for his forgery, had moved to a small cabin on the property's edge, where he worked as the ranch foreman, slowly rebuilding his relationship with his son through shared labor and grudging respect. In Riverside, the new schoolhouse stood complete, with large windows that filled the classrooms with light and shelves lined with books donated by Violetta's Eastern connections. The boarding house had also been rebuilt, larger than before and now owned by Mrs. Holloway rather than merely managed by her. On a perfect June morning, with the mountains painted purple against the horizon and meadow flowers blooming across the ranch, Matthew Jenkins waited at an altar erected beside the stream where he had played as a child. Judge Wilson stood ready to perform the ceremony, while Robert Clark, who had parlayed his Jenkins story into a promotion to editor, served as best man. The small gathering of friends and neighbors fell silent as Violetta appeared at the end of the flower-strewn path, radiant in a gown of ivory silk. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on ordering it from Denver, declaring that Riverside's new schoolmistress and future mistress of the Jenkins Ranch deserved nothing less. As Violetta walked toward him, Matthew felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life at precisely the moment when everything else was falling apart. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew felt as though his life had finally found its proper course after years of uncertainty. At the celebration that followed, Franklin Jenkins approached the newlyweds, looking uncomfortable in his best suit but determined to say his piece. "I want to give you both something," he said, producing a small wooden box. "It belonged to Matthew's mother. I should have given it to him years ago." Inside the box lay a delicate gold locket containing a miniature portrait of Martha Jenkins, her smile eerily similar to her son's. "She would have approved of you," Franklin told Violetta gruffly. "She had the same fire in her eyes when she believed in something." "Thank you," Violetta said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I," Matthew added, the simple statement conveying forgiveness that he was finally beginning to feel. As evening fell and the celebration continued with music and dancing under lantern light, Matthew and Violetta slipped away to the porch of their new home, gazing out at the land that was now truly theirs. "Happy?" Matthew asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I've been thinking." "About the east wing of the house," Violetta said thoughtfully. "We designed it for future children, but it stands empty now. I thought perhaps we might use part of it as a library for the community until it's needed for its intended purpose." Matthew smiled at his wife's continuing dedication to bringing education to Riverside. "A fine idea. Though I hope we don't have to wait too long before filling at least one of those rooms with its intended occupant." Violetta's smile turned mysterious. "Well, according to Dr. Thompson, we should expect our first child around Christmas." Matthew froze, then turned her to face him. "Truly." "You're certain?" "Quite certain," she confirmed, laughing at his stunned expression. "I wanted to be sure before telling you." Joy unlike anything Matthew had ever known surged through him as he lifted Violetta off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "A child," he marveled. "Our child." "The beginning of our family," Violetta agreed softly when he set her down. "The one we both needed." As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, the land stretching around them with all its promise and possibility, Matthew realized that his mother's legacy lived on not just in the ranch she had loved, but in the new family taking root there. Building on the past while creating a future neither he nor Violetta could have imagined when fate first brought them together in a small frontier town called Riverside.